Main objectives of the RBA are to achieve stability of the currency, maintenance of full employment, and the economic prosperity and welfare of the people of Australia. In pursuing the goal of medium-term price stability, both we, the Reserve Bank, and the government agree on the target of keeping consumer price inflation between 2 and 3% on average over the cycle. Two possible decisions based on economic conditions set out above, the Chinese growth rate and inflation and wage growth, are to lower the cash rate, in other words, expansionary monetary policy. Chinese economic growth, much like most of the advanced economies, has recently slowed down dramatically since 2010. This is because Chinese officials have signaled less emphasis on growth, pledging in December to shift focus on cracking down on financial risks, pollution, and poverty in the coming years. Australia's economic growth, which is propagated by China's, has also slowed down to around 2.4% in the January quarter due to lower amounts of exports to China, as reflected in the drop in exports since 2015. Furthermore, inflation is lower than the target band of 2 to 3%, averaging 1.9% over the past 5 months. Economists predict that this is a result of the declining housing market and a weaker domestic consumption than expected. Wage growth is stalling in the recent years to around 2%. Despite attempts of labour market reforms, the workforce has fractured and wage inequality has deepened, and average wage growth has stagnated. This is because of the modernisation of the economy as well as the weakening influence of unions. Overall, the international and domestic conditions are not short-term shocks or problems, thus problems associated with them will not be elevated without external interventions, such as monetary policy and fiscal policy. A loose monetary policy occurs when the money supply is expanded and is easily accessible to citizens to encourage economic growth rates. This involves using the action known as open market operations, influencing the amount of funds in the banks, exchange settled accounts. In an expansionary monetary policy, we will buy back government bonds from the banks, increasing the amount of funds within the ESA accounts and thus increasing the supply of funds in the overnight cash market. By increasing the supply of funds, there will be put a downward pressure on the cash rate, which in turn will lower the 90-day bills and longer-term rates. A decrease in interest rates will naturally lead to increased aggregate demand due to extra incentives to invest in other money-making alternatives, for instance, capital, due to higher potential returns. However, this can also be explained through the aggregate demand formula. An increase in R, the real interest rate, will cause Y, the aggregate demand, to lower. The monetary transmission mechanism can influence the economy as evident in the graph. A shift in the aggregate demand curve will lead to an increase in inflation, boosting the low 1.9 rate we currently have and preventing deflationary fears, while also boosting the economy closer to potential output, thus increasing economic growth. The other method is quantitative easing. Cash rate has been steadied at a low 1.5% because of the steady decline since the global financial crisis due to inflation and growth. However, has failed to stimulate the economy to a large extent. Because the cash rate is already this low, the monetary policy may lose some of its effectiveness. Thus, you must resort to a more unconventional policies. To carry out quantitative easing, central banks create money by buying securities such as government bonds from banks with electronic cash that did not exist before. The new money swells the size of the bank reserves in the economy by quantity of assets purchased, hence quantitative easing. Like lowering interest rates, quantitative easing is supposed to stimulate the economy by encouraging banks to make more loans. Effects of the economy on the economy are much like the expansionary policy, as it will lower the interest rates through the same mechanism as monetary policy and have the same effects as monetary policy. However, it may lead to uncontrolled inflation if not executed properly, depending on the velocity of cash. Thus, it is safer to do expansionary monetary policy for the time being.